Hello and welcome back to the channel. One of my pet peeves is terminology and assumptions about ship types, especially for the 17th century. For that is the period in which I'm most deeply interested and probably most knowledgeable if you exclude Ottoman seafaring, which willy-nilly I seem to have become one of the world's experts in that field. Today I would like to speak a little bit about Dutch yachts. I may have mentioned it somewhere else in the videos on this channel, but today we will really concentrate on this briefly. One of the impetuses behind this video actually is the quote-unquote Onrust replica. The replica is the word in quotation marks here, that is currently housed at the Essex River, Connecticut River Museum in Essex, Connecticut. And I have nothing against the vessel. I'm sure that it is reasonable guesswork, guesstimate that has nothing to do with traditional boat building methods, but from a very great distance, for example from Mars, it looks very accurate and beautiful. However, I do question the whole concept of the vessel, because Onrust, for those who may not remember the story, Alexander Blok, early in the 17th century, wintered and was clearing, or rather careening, his ship on what is now on Manhattan, approximately where now New York City is. In the process, a fire broke out and destroyed his ship Tiger. That is a completely different story that perhaps we shall address some other time, whether the Tiger has been discovered, whether it is still lost, and what of that ship survives. So, enough about the Tiger. But after the ship was destroyed, Blok and his crew launched, constructed from the remains of the vessel and from locally grown timber, built a new vessel, which they named Onrust, and which is described in the documents as a yacht. With that vessel, he continued in the spring the exploration of the New England coast and trade with the Native Americans, and eventually crossed the North Atlantic back to the Netherlands. So far, so good. Generations of authors, and obviously the creators of the so-called replica, have assumed, based on later information and lack of understanding of Dutch ship building and terminology, that if it is a yacht, it necessarily is a single-masted, fore and aft rigged vessel with beautiful big lee boards. I would not challenge the possibility, a theoretical possibility, of such a vessel crossing the North Atlantic. After all, the Vikings did it in open vessels, and Hugo Willen did it in a 3-meter boat, and many other people have crossed the ocean with all sorts of utterly unfit for service sorts of forms of transportation. So theoretically, at least, it is not completely impossible for such a yacht to actually cross the Atlantic. But I am pretty certain that what they actually built was something totally different. It is very likely to have been what the Dutch normally call a yacht, and that is essentially the equivalent of an English sixth-rate in the 17th century. It is a small 3-masted vessel. For most explorations by the West and East India companies, and Blok was part of this movement, we always see yachts being 3-masted vessels whenever they are employed in long-distance sailing. The yacht, as we understand it, the single-masted vessel with the lee boards, was essentially protected watercraft. They were used for representative purposes, they were used for communications, but they were not used to cross seas and to cross open bodies of water of the sizes of oceans. So what does such a vessel look like? Here I'm taking full advantage of my friend Abhoffing's publications, one that came out back in 2000. It is the ships of Adel Tasman. And of course there is a link up there for a view through the book. It is unfortunately long out of print, but you can still sometimes find it on used book sites. Well, this is one of the drawings that came with the book about Tasman. The drawings are by Ab's long-term collaborator, Kroum. And this is representing a typical early 17th century or first half of the 17th century yacht. As you can see, it is essentially a small frigate, three-masted vessel, has nothing to do with lee boards. It is not a single fore and aft rig. This is an infinitely more workable solution to what we know Alexander Bloch did after he constructed the Onrust. So I am just about ready to bet the farm that this is the sort of vessel that he and his crew constructed. While we are on the subject of yachts, I should point out that some years ago, the Australians decided to reconstruct what such a yacht may have looked like, a three-masted yacht. That was based on very serious scholarly statistical research into contemporary iconography, into the usual sources, that is to say, construction charters that have survived, especially in the East India archives, Nicholas Witsen's book, and other sources which contain typical proportions, typical dimensions for different yachts. So all this information was processed in a very interesting and significant way. And as a result of this research, multi-year research, they constructed a vessel, three-masted vessel, following typical traditional Dutch boat building, assembling the bottom first, adding the frames only after the bottom was completely put together. They did use power tools, they did use electricity to light the hole where the vessel was constructed, but otherwise they did their best to stick as closely as possible to the traditional Dutch shipbuilding methods. Thus, I think that this vessel, named Duyfken, is probably a reasonable representation of what a yacht of the 17th century would have really looked like, and how it would have behaved at sea. Extensive program was undertaken of sailing the vessel back from Australia to Europe and back again. There are at least 2 or 3 articles published by the skipper and the main scholars involved in the project. The ship still survives. It is now a museum piece. It is on display in Australia. I read somewhere that it is no longer actively sailed, but until fairly recently it was. It was taking even tourists for short sails. The point of the action is that they carried out an extensive experimental program with Duyfken. And that I found very interesting, because much of what we see in contemporary Dutch art, maritime art, has always been questioned. For example, there are numerous paintings showing vessels, three-masted real ships in heavy weather, in storms, with their topsails lowered to half-mast. And suddenly you see this huge ballooning sail in front of the vessel that you would think that no modern sailor would even consider doing something like this. We all know when the wind is up, you tighten the sheets, you flatten the sail as much as possible, or you strike it completely, or you reef it. Most of these sails could not yet be reefed. And yet, of the Agulhas, the captain of the Duyfken was encountering exactly such severe conditions, and he attempted to do exactly what he had seen in art, because hitherto the ship was behaving exactly as described in contemporary logbooks, memoirs, etc. So he said, what if the old mariners of the 17th century actually knew something about these ships and knew how to sail them, and the artists represented exactly this? Because let's face it, the clients of these artists were sea captains, ship owners, people perfectly well knowledgeable in handling ships, who are unlikely to accept misrepresentation. And so that's what he did. He lowered his fore and main topsail half down the mast, and to his utter astonishment, the vessel was capable of making way to weather against the wind, that is to say, beating into the wind with half-lowered topsails. The lowering of the topsails eased the pressure on the masts. The ship sailed on flatter bottom and continued to make progress to weather. In other words, ancient sources knew what they were doing and what they were talking about. So with this, I will bring this video to an end by yet again repeating that, in my humble opinion, and take it for whatever it is worth, the current vessel called Onrust may very well have been representative of the sort of yachts used around Amsterdam, on the Zuiderzee, on the inner waters of the Netherlands, but is extremely unlikely to be representative of what Bloch and his crew constructed after the demise of the Tiger. And with this, I end my preaching for the day, wishing you all the best, a most wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you next time. Thank you for watching.